Okay, so Loftus and Palmer study is looking at eyewitness testimony of reconstructed car crashes. So eyewitness testimony is about you recalling the details of something which you have seen, have witnessed. So if you have witnessed a car crash and you are giving details of that, of what you saw, what you heard, that would be your eyewitness testimony. And what we think is that eyewitness testimony and how accurate that is can be affected by lots of different factors. So what Loftus and Palmer are doing is looking at this branch of memory that is eyewitness testimony and trying to find some of the things which will reduce that accuracy. So first we're going to look at a bit of background information about memory. So memory is the term given to the structures and processes involved in storage and retrieval of information. So when you've experienced something or seen something, in order for that to get turned into a memory, you store it. But then it doesn't just stay there forever, because at some point you're going to talk about it and you're going to use it. So when you are accessing that information, or what you might call remembering, it is retrieval of that information. So you're accessing some stored information. So memory can take many different forms. So it can be images, it can be sounds, it can be meanings, and it covers three parts of information processing. So you've got encoding, storage, and retrieval. Okay, so we're going to talk about what each of those mean. So the first part of you forming a memory is your encoding. So your encoding refers to how your system changes information that comes into your memory system. So you've got things that are happening in your environment, and all that's coming into your system through the senses. So smells, sounds, tastes, sights, feel, all these things are coming in through those systems. Okay, so what encoding is about taking that sensory information and changing it into a format that can be stored in your memory. Okay, so there's three main ways that information can be encoded or changed into a manageable format. So it can be visual, so sometimes you remember what it looks like. It can be acoustic, so sometimes you remember what it sounds like. And sometimes it can be semantic, so you remember the meaning. Okay. Then it comes to storage. So storage refers to how long the memory lasts for, and how much of it you're able to hold at once. So different parts of your memory have a different duration, so they'll last different lengths of time, and have a different capacity, meaning some parts of your memory can hold more information and some parts hold less. So most adults in their short-term memory can store between 5 and 9 items. So this is called the magic number 7, because the average number is 7 items plus or minus 2. So that's between 5 and 9. But we think that your capacity of long-term memory is unlimited. So we think that there's no limit to the amount of information that you can keep and remember in your long-term memory. And again, in your long-term memory, we think that this information probably lasts a lifetime, but in your short-term memory, it can be 30 seconds or even shorter than that. Now, there's kind of different techniques that you can use to increase your memory capacity and duration. So an example is chunking. We'll talk more about that in lesson, but that's an example of how you can hold more than 5 or 9 items. Okay, and then once you've stored that memory, you're going to retrieve it. So memory retrieval is getting that information out of storage. If you can't remember something, it's often because you're unable to retrieve it, because there's been some kind of retrieval error. Okay, now short-term memory is stored and retrieved sequentially. So if you've got a list of words, when you are trying to retrieve that information and you've only looked at it a brief period of time ago, so within the last 30 seconds, and you've been holding those words in your mind, when you're retrieving that information, you normally start at the top of the list, the first word, and work your way through to try and remember them. And in your long-term memory, it's stored and retrieved by association. So you might find that sometimes you hear a particular song and you're like, oh, remember when this happened last summer? So you have these associations between different things, and that helps you to retrieve stored information. So there's many different models of how memory works. So lots of psychologists have got different ideas about how memory works. And a really common one is the multi-store model of memory. So this was developed by Atkinson and Schifrin, and it's quite a simplistic model. So they basically said that you've got this sensory store for information. Now that's really brief, but it has an extremely large capacity. So if you think about all the things which are probably coming in through your senses, so changes in lighting, different sights, different sounds, different smells, all of that information is passing through that sensory store. So it's very brief, but it can hold a lot. And then if you pay attention to something, that then means that it's going to be passed into your short-term memory, short-term store. So like we said, short-term store, we think that can hold 7 items plus or minus 2, and the duration is maximum of 30 seconds. If you rehearse that information though, so if you keep going over that information, it's going to keep it in your short-term memory for longer. So when you get given a list of words to remember, a list of numbers, and you're going 125, 326, 912, because you're trying to remember them, that's rehearsal, and it's going to hold them in your short-term memory for longer. However, if you don't rehearse it, or sometimes even if you do, if it reaches that 30 seconds and you've not done anything with that information will be lost through forgetting. Now, some of that short-term memory information can be passed to the long-term memory, where we've said the capacity is probably unlimited and the duration is unlimited. And then if you're ever going to retrieve that information, it's passed back to the short-term store temporarily. Okay, so information transfers between these two. So it's just worth you understanding how psychologists see memory as working, but that's kind of it. So you've got lots of different stores for different types of memory, and these stores can work together or they can pass information to one another, and they all have different durations, different capacities, and they all have different ways of encoding as well. Okay, so when it comes to eyewitness testimony, there's lots of things which we think can affect how accurate somebody's eyewitness testimony is. So there's reconstructive memory and schema-driven errors. So sometimes you will have a bit of a gap in your memory. So you might not remember all the details of an event, and it's about how your brain will sort of fill in the gaps. That's what reconstructive memory is about, and we'll look a bit more at that. You've got the effects of leading questions. So a leading question is a question which possibly suggests an answer or suggests what the researcher is looking for in the wording of the question. So if I said, psychology is your favourite subject, isn't it? That's suggesting that I want you to say, yes, psychology is my favourite subject. So it's a leading question, it's leading you towards a potential answer or suggesting an answer to you. So those are the two key ones for Loftus and Palmer. The reconstructive memory with the schema-driven errors and the effects of leading questions. Now, there are other things, so weapon focus is one, so if somebody's carrying a weapon, that can affect your memory of the event and what you remember because you focus on that weapon rather than the peripheral details of a scene, meaning those bits are less able to be recalled, and that can include things like the appearance of the attacker or burglar or whatever it is who's carrying that weapon. You don't remember details of their face because you're focusing on the weapon. The effects of anxiety or arousal, so if you're experiencing stress, that can affect your memory. So it can help your memory to a certain point, but then it can actually harm your memory after that and mean that you're testimony is less accurate. And retrieval cues as well. So retrieval cues, a cue is something which can prompt your memory. So if you think about, if I gave you 2 lists of words to remember, you and a partner, and your partner was just given a list of words and told to remember them and then write them down as many as they could, that's just normal generic retrieval. But if I was going to use a retrieval cue, what I might do is give your partner the same list of countries to remember, and then when they're recalling them, I give them the first letter of each country, or I say it sounds like each country. And that will help them to recall information, because it will sort of like prompt their memory, and that's like a retrieval cue, something that prompts your memory. So we're going to look at reconstructive memory and leading questions. So when it comes to reconstructive memory, Bartlett in 1932 conducted a study in which they suggested that memory isn't necessarily a direct record of what you've witnessed. So there are certain things which can affect how you encode information and also how you retrieve information. So sometimes when you're remembering something, or when you're trying to encode something, if there is information that's already stored in your memory, which is either similar or conflicting information, it can affect what you remember, or it'll affect what you actually store, and also how this information is understood, structured, and organised. So basically, depending on what you already have in your memory of an event might be different to somebody else's. And that's partly because of something called a schema. So a schema is a knowledge structure that relates to commonly encountered objects, situations, or people. So a schema is kind of like how you know when you go to like the self-checkout area at Asda, and there's a queue of people. Your schema is how you know that you wait in queue, you wait your turn, then you put your bag out and you scan your items. So it's how you don't just walk out the shop without paying, or it's how you know not to just push to the front of the queue, because a schema helps us to decide how to behave in a particular situation. So a schema can be made up of your past experiences. It can be made up of things that people have told you. It can be made up of things that you've seen in films and on TV. But they essentially can guide you in understanding situations and how to behave. Okay, so similarly, a common one is you know how to behave when you go to a restaurant. So if you go into a restaurant, you know that you wait to be seated at a table. And then you know that when you get to the table, you're going to get given a menu, and then you know that you're going to pick what you want, and then you're going to wait for the waiter to come over, and then you're going to tell him what you want. So it's kind of like that schema that you have inside you, that framework tells you that that is what happens. And that's how you should behave whenever you go into a restaurant. Okay, but the thing with these schemas is, because they're based on things that are familiar to you and things that you have experience of, they can act as a filter to what you actually see and what you actually remember. So sometimes if things don't fit with your schema, they can not be encoded and not be stored or not be retrieved, or something that doesn't fit with your schema might actually end up being changed to fit with your schema when you're storing that information. Okay. So, for example, there, if I gave you a list of words to remember, and you had the words fast, expensive, small, shiny in there, that might make you think sports car. So your schema is that a sports car is fast, it's usually expensive, it's usually shiny, and it's usually small. Okay, so it helps you to link information together. So when it comes to schemas, if you've witnessed a crime, you end up filtering information which ends up influencing what you can actually remember, and it might end up distorting your memory because of things you've seen before, because of assumptions about what usually happens, or stereotypes and beliefs about crime and criminals. So if it's like quite a blue collar crime, like armed robbery, so you've witnessed an armed robbery in a shop, even if you didn't see that victim, perpetrator, even if you didn't see the person who's committed that crime, you might develop a picture of what that person looks like in your head because you have past experiences and assumptions and stereotypes based on things in the media or things in films or other things you've witnessed in life about what kind of person would commit armed robbery. So you might be thinking, like, he's got lots of tattoos, he was quite a big guy, he's got a shaved head, he was wearing a hoodie or he was wearing a mask. So it kind of filters information to fit with a schema, which might end up meaning that you either don't remember stuff or you end up remembering things that actually didn't happen and weren't there. Okay, so that's what schema-driven errors are. Now, another thing that can influence your memory, according to Loftus and Palmer, is leading questions. Okay, so there's just a little like cartoon strip to give an example. So, welcome to Bananarama. Would you like to buy a banana? No, it's not a very interesting product. Okay, so that's not a it kind of is still a little bit of a leading question because it's kind of what you'd say, yes, I would, but it's not as leading as the next one. So, how excited are you about purchasing a fantastic banana? I'm quite excited. So it's kind of, the question can get an interviewee to change what they're going to say. And the idea is actually it can change your memory as well. So it's not just changing what you say, but it's changing what you remember. So we think that leading questions can actually introduce new information. So if you've witnessed somebody breaking into a house and you can't necessarily remember what colour hoodie the lad was wearing, you might end up remembering that he was wearing a red hoodie. If I said, was it a red hoodie that he was wearing, did you say? You might then actually find that your memory changes so that when you're picturing this event now, you picture him in a red hoodie. Even if it might have been a blue hoodie or a green hoodie, it might not have even been wearing a hoodie. Okay, but you might find that your memory changes because the leading question I've used has introduced new information. Leading information may also activate the wrong schemas in a witness's mind. Okay, so again, if we think back to the example of the fellow who'd committed armed robbery, if I was interviewing you and I said things like, did he have lots of tattoos? Even if he didn't have lots of tattoos, that might activate a different schema in you. It might have been quite like a tall, skinny, blonde fella who'd committed this armed robbery with no tattoos, and suddenly you might be picturing like quite a large, muscly man covered in tattoos, shaved head. So you might be picturing like something completely different now because I've used a particular word that's activated a memory or a framework of what you think that kind of person would look like. And that means that sometimes you might end up recalling incorrect information. Okay, so you either misinformation or you give fake information without even realising it. Okay, so that's all your background stuff. Now, Loftus and Palmer then aim to investigate how information provided after an event, such as using leading questions, which, as we know, provide new information, can influence a witness's memory of that event. Okay, so the samples, who's in the study, they conducted 2 experiments. So the first sample was 45 students from Washington University in experiment 1. And then in experiment 2, it was a larger sample. They now have 150 students. Okay, they are manipulating an independent variable in controlled, standardized conditions to measure the effect on a dependent variable. So it is a lab experiment. And participants only take part in one condition of the IV, meaning it's an independent measures design. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to go through the procedure and the IVs and DVs for experiments 1 and 2, and then we'll go over the results. Okay, so in experiment 1, all the participants are shown 7 film clips. Now this is standardised because they're all the same, 7 film clips. They were originally from a driver safety film. 3 of them were of real incidences of crashes, and 4 of them were staged crashes. So 1 of these was going at 20 miles an hour, 1 was at 30 miles an hour, and 2 were at 40 miles an hour. Okay, so they watched these 7 clips, and after each clip, the participant is given a questionnaire. So the first thing that they asked them to do was describe the accident. So in their own words, what had they seen? And then they were asked a series of questions. Okay, now in this questionnaire, there was one question called the critical question, and it had a critical verb in it. So the question was about how fast were the cars going when they either hit, smashed, collided, contacted, or bumped each other. Okay, so you got 45 participants, so you end up with 9 participants who get how fast were the cars going when they hit each other, 9 who get how fast when they smashed, 9 for collided, 9 for contacted, bumped. Okay, so they're only getting one question for every film clip. They're just getting that one question, okay, with that one verb in it in the questionnaire. So they're not all going to see all of those verbs, they're just going to see one of those verbs. Now this was counterbalanced, so it was shown in different orders to each participant to prevent order effects, and this whole procedure lasted about an hour and 30 minutes. Okay, now you've got different IVs and DVs in experiments 1 and 2. So in the experiment 1, the IV is the wording of that critical question that's hidden in the questionnaire. So how fast were the cars going when they hit, smashed, collided, contacted, or bumped each other? Okay, and the way that's operationalized is with those verbs, so hit, smashed, collided, contacted, bumped. And the DV is the speed estimated on that question in miles per hour. Okay, so that's what happened in experiment 1. Now in experiment 2, we've got different participants. So all participants are shown a 1-minute film which contains a 4-second multiple car crash. Okay, so it's a 1-minute film, and within that film there's a multiple car crash which lasts 4 seconds. Then they're given a questionnaire, so again they're asked to describe the accident in their own words and then answer a set of questions about what they have witnessed. Okay, and like I said, they've got different IVs and DVs in this. So the IV is the wording of a question in the questionnaire, so it's a different critical question this time. So how fast were the cars going when they smashed each other, when they hit each other? Okay, so they're not being asked all 5 verbs this time. When this time we've only got 3 categories, 3 conditions of the IV. So we've got how fast were they going when they smashed each other, how fast were they going when they hit each other, and then you've got a third group who's your control group who are not asked about the speed at all. And then you've got 50 participants in each condition because we've got 150 participants overall. Okay, and now what they're measuring this time isn't the speed. Okay, so obviously in answer to that question, they would answer with speed, but that's not what we're interested in. That's what we're interested in experiment 1. In experiment 2, what we then do is a week later, we ask the participants to complete another 10 questions. Now this time the critical question is, did you see any broken glass? Now again, this is counterbalanced, so it's displayed in a random position in the questionnaire. And the DV is whether they answered yes or no. Now the important thing is that in this clip that they're shown, there was no broken glass at all. Okay, now experiment 1, we've got some quantitative data from experiment 1. So you need to try and remember those mean speed estimates. Okay, realistically, you need to remember at least some of them. So smashed, they got 40.5 as a mean speed estimate miles per hour, collided 39.3, bumped 38.1, hit 34, contacted 31.8. Okay, so we can see there that smashed has got the highest speed estimate compared to contacted or hit. So we could say that the leading question and the verb in the leading question has changed the memory of the event. However, the researchers could also say that the participants had shown response bias. So response bias is when you might be unsure exactly how you're supposed to answer that question, or you don't really have any memory of that, or you don't really know how to estimate speed, so you actually have no idea how fast they were going. And so you adjust your estimate to fit in with the expectation of the question. So if we're saying contacted, you probably don't think that's gone very fast. But if you say smashed, you've probably gone a hell of a lot faster than they have if they've contacted. So you kind of adjust what you say in response to the wording of the question. So we don't know whether it's just that response bias, so I just don't really know how to answer, so I'm just going to guess in line with the information you've given me, or if we've actually distorted somebody's memory and they remember that car is going faster. Okay, so that's the point of the second experiment now, is to see whether using a highly rated word for speed, smashed, compared to a lower one, so hit, will actually distort somebody's memory of what happened. So here, the mean speed estimate in experiment 2 for smashed was 11 miles an hour and for hit was 8 miles an hour. So we can see that those speed estimates are different, but remember in experiment 2, that's not the main thing that we're interested in. The main thing that we're interested in is this broken glass. Okay, so if you're in the smashed condition, 16 people said yes, that was broken glass. 34 said no. However, if you're in the hit condition, 7 only said yes, and 43 said no, and similar for the controls. So 6 said yes, and 44 said no. So what we can see is that those who read the word smashed were actually twice as likely to recall seeing broken glass compared to the hit and the control group. Okay. Alright, so again, know both these findings. So remember the speed estimate, but that's not the main DV. This is the DV, whether there's the broken glass or not, but that could be another finding. So if you ever get asked for 2 findings from experiment 2, these are the 2 that you could give. Now, remember, they did actually collect some qualitative data. So they did get the participants to write a written account of what they'd seen before answering the questions in both experiment 1 and experiment 2, but they didn't analyse this. So when you get asked, or if you get asked what type of data was collected, you need to be wary of what you say for this study. So if you get asked what type of data was collected, you need to justify what you're saying. So I would say they collected both quantitative and qualitative, with the quantitative being the speed estimates or the number of people that said yes or no to whether they recalled seeing broken glass, but also they gave an unanalysed written account of what they had seen, which consisted of qualitative data. So you just need to know that they did collect both, even though they only analysed the quantitative. Okay, so a few conclusions. So firstly, people are not very good at judging vehicular speed. So overall, people weren't very accurate when it comes to estimating speeds. The way that a question is phrased can influence a participant's response, such as the verb used, changing the answers given. So that's linking to your response bias. So I might be able to change the things that you say, because if you're not sure and I use a particular verb, you might give me a particular answer. And also, misleading post-event information can distort a person's memory. So post-event information is information provided after an event. So if I am interviewing you and I'm using leading questions after you've seen something, that's post-event information, because I'm giving you new information. And if that information is misleading by using verbs like smashed, when actually the speed wasn't very high, or contacted when the speed was higher, then I can distort your memory. I can make sure that you remember broken glass, or make it more likely that you remember broken glass. So Loftus and Palmer therefore propose you've got two kinds of information when you have a complex occurrence. So when you have like an event that you've witnessed and you need to store that information, that's a complex event. So you got firstly the information that comes from the perception of the original event, so what you actually saw in that event. And then also you've got this post-event information that's gained after the event. Okay, and what happens is over time this information becomes integrated together. So if I fed you some misleading information after an event, some post-event information, you wouldn't then be able to tell which parts of your memory are actually from the event and which parts of your memory are because of what I've said to you after the event. Okay, so it makes it really difficult to tell whether memory of events and eyewitness testimony is actually accurate or not. Okay, so there's your reference. So as I say, the study was on the reconstruction of automobile destruction, an example of interaction between language and memory. So it's looking at eyewitness testimony and how language can affect your memory of those car crashes. Okay, so that's basically pretty much it for the study. We are going to evaluate the study in the lesson, but I'll just go through quickly a few points. So in real life situations, there will be an element of surprise. You would feel emotions. You might not end up recalling that information until much later in time. You would end up discussing this information with other people, and that would also change your memory. So because it's done with like film clips in such a controlled setting, it's quite low in ecological validity. But because it's in that control setting, you've got control over other variables, and you do things like counterbalancing and standardization, and that means you're more able to establish cause and effect between the IV, so like the verb used, and the speed estimate. Also, participants, they're all students, so you have to think about if that biases the sample in any way. because it's not necessarily going to be representative. You may also think about like students who used to being asked questions and being tested, and think about their age, young age, how that influences their perceptions of speed. Can they actually even drive? So in general, the sample lacked population validity. And because they didn't collect that qualitative, well, they didn't analyse that qualitative data they collected, you can evaluate that by saying, well, even though they've collected that information, they didn't analyse it. So we've got quantitative data that's easy to compare, easy to make generalisations from, but it doesn't allow us to explain the reasons for behaviour or compare their accounts of what they've seen. So did they seem like they thought the car was going fast before they rated it as going at 40 miles an hour? But it's useful, so we've got loads of practical applications. So anybody who needs to ask questions as part of a job, so like teachers or people who are in an interview setting, or police questioning witnesses, even things with like therapies, not using leading questions to change somebody's perception of how they feel. All of these things are practical applications, because we can, make sure we avoid leading questions when doing these things. Also, you can say that because this task was difficult, so estimating speed is difficult anyway, but also because you're doing it on a video, that's even more difficult than in real life. So that might mean that because the results of this study could have been affected by that, by the fact that it's a difficult task, we can't necessarily generalise how well people performed to explain how leading questions can affect memory. Because if we'd done it in real life, that's probably because it's more realistic, more able to be generalised to explain real life behaviour, meaning that all these things that we've said that we can use it for in the real world are based on realistic data. And then you've got other things, so in the article they said things like the type of car or the person that was driving might also influence somebody's eyewitness testimony. So if it was a lad driving, like a young lad, we might think, oh, he's probably going to drive faster, or an old woman, we might think might drive slower, or be a worse driver. There's all these different sort of stereotypes based on who's driving. Also, like a sporty car, we're probably going to judge as driving faster than a people carrier. So all of these are other factors which could be considered. Okay, so make sure you've got really thorough notes on the study. I'll be checking those notes in your next lesson, and we'll also recap the study in your next lesson, and we'll go on to evaluate the study again as well.